Hey, how's it going? I'm Nick, and I'm your host on the Ekho Academy podcast, a podcast dedicated to uncovering helpful tools and strategies to elevate your career. On today's episode, we talk about how to handle stress as a result of work. And my guest today is Kwon Kim. Kwon is currently the Director of Neuroscience Strategy at Holmusk, a company focused on transforming the lives of people with behavioral health and chronic diseases through data driven medicine. Kwon has a PhD in neuroscience with a focus on the brain mechanism of stress. He has over 20 years of work experience in life sciences, consulting, and biotechnology across North America, Europe, and now Asia. To find out more about Kwon, his work, and this episode, you can check out echo.academy/Kwon. That's ekho.academy/KWON. So, without further ado, here's my interview with Kwon. Kwon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So, you work for Holmusk. I think before we even get into the topic and the subject matter today, which is all about stress, maybe you could just let us know what you do at Holmusk and what Holmusk does at all.
I think that's a really relevant question because what we do actually is very closely related to stress, the topic of today's session. Holmusk is a Singapore-based startup company which has offices also in the US, UK, Switzerland, China, and Japan. It's a company that is involved in digital health and data analytics with a focus on mental illness, mental health. We actually build in silico models of depression and Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
So we use artificial intelligence with the work that we do. And we work with pharmaceutical companies to help them with drug development for diseases. And we also want to be able to help the patient as well by better understanding their situation and to be able to predict the progression of the disease and how they might respond to certain treatments. So as a neuroscientist, I provide scientific guidance on these projects. And given the relationship between mental illness and stress, I think this is a good segue to the questions that you may have.
Yeah. And before we get into that, for people who don't know, myself included, what does digital health mean exactly?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
We apply artificial intelligence data that is available. For example, in the EHR, electronic health records, there's a lot of data there on the patient's diagnosis, the clinician notes. We're able to take all of that information in and using the models that we build, taking this digital data, digital health data, and gain insights into the disease, better treatments, better patient outcomes.
Right. And does the data you collect only include your patients, so to speak, or is it like a general database that you get from all the hospitals so that you can, kind of calculate perhaps more accurately?
We can use data from almost any source. What we have right now is we actually own specific data from mental health centers in the US, 30 centers. We have data from over 500,000 patients, covering sometimes decades, 20 years. And so we have this rich data set that we can use to mine to be able to, for example, build models of depression.
Right.
There's other data sources that we're looking at. What we would like to do, and this is the direction that we're moving, is to be able to build an app that can collect data in real time, 24/7 on the patient. Once we have their permission, that we can use to supplement the data from what the physicians are capturing whenever they go and visit the physician.
Yeah.
So that's our goal, where we're with all the amount of time that a patient actually spends with a physician, let's say a depressed patient, is really amounts to maybe several minutes, maybe an hour over a course of, let's say, a year.
Yeah.
Maybe hours over a course of a year. Now, but there's all this other data set that where the patient is generating whenever they're on their iPhone. We would like to be able to use that information to help the patient.
Right. Well, that's interesting. And you're right. I mean, based on my experience, visiting a psychiatrist, etc., I think the amount of time I actually spend with him is almost negligible. I mean, back when I was actually doing that. And yet, with that very limited data, he has to find a way to solve my problem. So, it's good that, we're moving in a direction where there's more data that's accessible to kind of help people who might be in a position that I was in, recover more efficiently, I would say.
Yeah. And with that, this isn't really new technology for us, because we already have a platform that's working. We have an app for originally created for diabetics. We're now using this for helping people eat better diet, dietary choices. And so we already have a platform that's working well. So we were just repurposing it for other diseases.
Yeah. And this is a good segue to the main topic, which is stress, and something that I think is quite personal to me as well, because I think one of the things that was mentioned to me as I was, recovering from my clinical depression, was that they would always say stress would be a trigger for, potential relapse. And so I was always, it was always in the back of my mind. It was always something that I feared that could trigger something and force me back into that spiral. And the truth is, it turns out, when I speak to others, nobody really understands stress as thoroughly as they think they might. So perhaps a good place to start is, how do we define stress?
That's a good question, because that term is tossed around a lot.
Yeah.
And so because of the fact that I have a background in this, let me start with a really high-level definition. Stress is the body's way of rising to a challenge. And we can talk about stress in terms of the stressor, the causal factor for stress. And we can also talk about the stress response, which is the body's response to the stressor. So the stressor can be external or internal. An example of external stressor might be the physical danger from a hungry lion.
Right.
Internal, it could be psychological or emotional. For example, dealing with a sick family member. That takes quite a psychological toll. Or it could be worrying about some imagined future non-existent threat.
Right.
The stress response by the body, this initiates what you've probably heard, the flight or flight response.
Right.
So let's take an example of this hungry lion that's tracking you down.
Yeah.
There's a series of complex reactions in the body, neurological and endocrinologic systems. And there are some key substances that are released as a part of the stress response. There's the And you might have heard of this, the hormone cortisol
Yes, I have.
and the neurotransmitter adrenaline. So these are among the many milieu of chemicals that are released. And what they do in this situation, dealing with this lion, is that it sharpens mental focus. It energizes the heart and the lungs, provides more fuel to the muscles, and at the same time, it shuts down non-essential functions given this dire situation, such as digestion, reproduction. So the whole body is mobilized to survive the stress. And what's really interesting about this is that the body responds the same, irrespective of whether the stressor is the lion or some imaginary event in your mind.
Okay. And in essence, does that mean, biologically speaking at least, stress was it just designed to help us, number one, identify potential dangers, and number two, hone our basic instincts in a way that allows us to survive that potential danger?
Yeah. So biologically speaking, it's a fantastic system. It's helped us to survive and evolve for hundreds of thousands of years. And however, but in modern life, we're no longer facing threats every day, from lions, saber-toothed tigers, what have you.
Not many lions around.
Or saber-toothed tigers.
Saber-toothed tigers, yeah.
In modern life, we're dealing with more psychological stressors associated with work, traffic jam, what have you, all of these things. And we're not able to turn off the stress response. So I think this is probably a good place for me to make the distinction between acute and chronic stress. Acute stress is a good thing. We need to fight off the lion. Then that situation ends. Okay, we've either survived or we haven't.
Right.
But it ends. With chronic stress, and this is endemic of modern life, there's just so much that we're dealing with every single day. And, for example, we got family issues. We might have issues with health of family members, potential conflicts. In our careers, we're always, with work, we're always facing deadlines. We have financial pressures. Can we retire? The mortgages. Other stressors, traffic jams, thinking about climate change,
right.
The Wuhan virus.
Yeah.
And we could even, this can sometimes go into overload, and we could think about and be stressed about things, future events like terrorist attacks, meteor impacts on the earth. So our minds can conjure up any sort of dangers. So these psychological stressors can produce chronic stress in our lives. And so the impacts of chronic stress, it's very, very detrimental, and there is much data to support this. It impairs our immune system. So we're more susceptible to colds, diseases, brain degeneration.
Right.
It actually kills brain cells and impairs memory function. It produces heart disease, causes overweightness, promotes mental disorders, as I mentioned earlier. There's also genetic impacts, and there's been some studies that have shown that there's something called telomeres, which protects the ends of chromosomes from fraying. This can actually be shortened as a result of stress.
Interesting. And just to understand a little bit more clearly, how do we define acute stress and chronic stress in a more tangible way? And I'll try to elaborate on this. When it comes to acute stress, you mentioned that it ends and then you are somehow relieved of that stress. In theory, some of our other perhaps psychological related stressors does end, but somehow we don't feel alleviated from that stress. Does that count as acute as well? Because technically that stressor has been eliminated, right?
Yeah. But I think with modern life, there is the psychological stressor after stressor that just mounts up. And, the classic example of somebody staying up late at nights, worrying about all the woes of the world and their lives. And so it's chronic. The definition of the stress, the physical definition of a person being stressed is that their hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, and other hormones are elevated. And by constantly thinking of these issues, psychological issues, that elevates the stress. If truly you thought about something that's disturbed you psychologically, and then you let it go, you resolve it, and your body goes back to normal basal levels of the stress hormones, that could be that's an acute stressor that you've resolved. But it's when these ideas persist, or there's another issue that comes up, they pile on top of each other, and your body responds by continually releasing these hormones.
Got it. And so you mentioned that it's our body responding to the stresses, be it external or internal. So does that mean that we have no control over us becoming victim of our own stress?
Okay, that's a good question. We can control it, but before I answer that question, there's something else I just want to add to this conversation.
Please,
that stress, I've said before that stress is a good thing in small doses. In fact, I want to make a distinction between something called eustress and distress. This is the language that people in this field use. Eustress is what is considered good stress. It's stress is stimulation in life, and the goal in life is not to get rid of stimulation, but to get the right type of stimulation and in the right amounts. So that's why people do things like go on roller coaster rides, jump out of airplanes, climb mountains. This is, we need this.
Yeah.
But the bad stress, which we call distress, is when the situation becomes chronic. And one of the ways that where the stress becomes overwhelming is when we do not have control. So I want to speak to that now.
Yes, please,
because
yeah.
But let me approach it indirectly with citing some research from a researcher. His last name is Sapolsky, and I often cite this research. He's done some amazing work in this field. In addition to doing the classic lab work with rats and such, he studied wild baboons in Africa. So he followed this troop for basically decades, and what he does is, baboons are similar to ourselves in many respects, in terms of the stratified societies that they have, the hierarchy, the competitiveness, and also the fact that they only spend about 3 hours a day getting sufficient calories for the whole day, rather than needing to forage and look for food, the whole time.
Right.
And what he did was, after witnessing various social interactions, like a fight between a couple of baboons and who won and lost, what he would actually do is blow dart these baboons and take their blood samples. And then he would actually measure stress hormones, antibodies, cholesterol, all sorts of other health indicators. And so, there's a lot of interesting findings coming from baboons. And let me sort of cite some of what he's found, and and the fact that it's actually very relevant to people.
Okay, yeah.
There are individual differences amongst baboons. There are the classic type A baboon personalities.
Wow. So alpha baboons?
Yeah. And these type A personalities, just as in humans, they pay the price in terms of disease. Always being wired in a tense like this, it does take a toll in the long run. And then there's some baboons that seem to be able to handle stress better because they have better social interactions with other individual baboons. So they're cultivating friendships.
Interesting.
Another difference amongst some baboons is that some of them are able to keep calmer during situations. They have more perspective, which helps. So these are ones that can tell in a situation if it's a real threat or not. They may be able to make that distinction better than some other baboons. And these particular baboons have shown that their stress hormone levels are much lower than those that are not able to make that distinction. And
did Sapolsky mention why that third set of baboons were able to develop this sort of wisdom to differentiate between what's a real threat and what's a perceived threat?
I don't think he went really. I can't speak to that actually. What particular features of the individual baboon. I just know that that's the overall way they presented themselves.
Gotcha.
So continuing on here. So basically, this body of work from baboons really confirms what we're finding in humans. And in fact, his work really helped our understanding of what's happening in humans. So in humans as well, there are individual differences. And I believe that we can actually control the way we respond to stress. In modern day life, the stressors that we encounter aren't so much these external threats, the lion. They're psychological. So because they're psychological, the way we think about it can help us.
Right.
And to build on what Sapolsky found in baboons, for example, having a perspective on the situation, and I'm speaking for myself, I can look at a situation and I can think of it as the glass is half empty or half full. The way I perceive the situation has a real impact on my stress level. We mentioned that type A individuals suffer more from the impacts of stress. Well, we can choose to be a little bit less type A in our work.
Is that possible though?
I think it's choices that we can make.
Got it.
Okay, life is full of deadlines and demands on our time, but it's a matter of saying, this is not to say that we're going to forego our responsibilities on our jobs or whatever, but we can say, this one less responsibility that's on my shoulders, well, maybe I could just push that out a little bit as opposed to trying to do it now. And in fact, I think in the long run, by being a little bit less type A, you're actually contributing more to the work situation,
right?
Because you're going to stay healthy and more focused.
Right.
Social network is really important. There's a study that I like to cite where they looked at parents with children that had physical or mental challenges. And so this is really a chronic lifelong situation that these children have. And they looked at the caretakers, the parents, and they found a link between how long they have lived with this chronic stress and the negative impacts in the body. So the longer they've lived with this child, the more detrimental effects in the body. However,
for the parents,
the parents, yes,
gotcha.
Yes, that's who they studied. However, they also found that those that were involved in support groups, social networks that help them deal with the situation, sharing with others, compassion, and all of that, these individuals showed reduced impacts of the stress.
Right.
So another way to control the situation. And also with stressors in life, if you could identify those that you can actually control and those that are outside of your control, that's a really helpful exercise. Those that you can't control, accept it. It is what it is. Rather
Right.
than trying to force change something that you can never change.
Right.
And then focusing your efforts on the things that you can change. For example, maybe there's, as far as control, things at work that you just cannot control. It is what it is. But maybe in your personal life, in whatever hobby, in whatever pastime that you have, there's something which you enjoy, and you can have control over that situation where you're the decision maker. So even though you don't have control in one setting, you've got it in another. And that's really helpful to you psychologically, knowing that.
Right. And can I also just interject and ask, and I'm speaking from my personal experience, so it'd be interesting, based on the studies and your experience. When I go through a period of chronic stress, and I'm trying to draw from my memory from a couple of years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago when this happened, I found that there was some level of impairment in terms of my ability to think logically. So when that happens, how do we shift our mindset so that stress doesn't get the best of us? Because it's like you mentioned, it's perception, right? Changing the way we think about things and being more positive. But when you're not in that right state of mind, it becomes increasingly challenging. And I wonder if you know of any solution to that.
Yeah. I mean, what you said is very true, that in the moment when the stress is on you and your stress hormones are just at its max, it does impair critical thinking, especially when it's a chronic situation, the ability to think logically. I think in those circumstances, the best thing to do is if you can just step back a little bit, try to gain control of that situation before you make any decisions. There's, I think that's, the only thing that I can say is don't react in the moment.
Right.
Take a breath, step back, assess the situation before you act, before you make decisions.
Right. So I suppose, yeah, that makes sense as well, because then it's almost irrespective of your impaired critical thinking, because you're taking a step back and choosing not to think and just letting yourself process everything.
Yeah. Processing. In fact, one of the things that my wife and I do is when there's major decisions that we need to make, especially when it's emotional, we try as much as we can say, okay, let's not make it now. Let's sleep on it. And then revisit it in the morning and make the decision.
Right. Interesting. And the second part that you talked about, and this is something that is of particular interest to me, and that's the social aspect of it, and building that network of people that you can count on. I suppose it's true as for monkeys as it is for us. I suppose the trick is, not the trick, sorry, the challenge is, unlike the animal kingdom, it would seem increasingly, or perhaps superficially, more difficult to find people you can form tribes with. Whereas in the animal kingdom, it's almost like it's set for you, right? Like somehow they just form this group. And I'm thinking of monkeys. I don't really know much about any other animal. But for humans, I think it's harder because we have different relationships for different things. We have family, we have friends, we have colleagues, and they all play different roles. And because of that, I don't know. It's hard to kind of understand how they can help or be part of the dynamic when you go through, the challenges of life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the higher you get up in the evolutionary ladder, the more complex that we become.
Yeah.
And yeah, so um, we have different relationships with different people, but irrespective of what category that you're talking about, be it family members, colleagues, or friends, within each of them, there's probably individuals that you can relate to better than others. And it's just forming those relationships.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, we are social animals, and having the social contacts is very important.
Right. And is it true what they say that, I mean, you are the company you keep, right? So if you're really stressed, would it be helpful if all your friends were people who are less type A and who are more carefree?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. Someone once said something interesting. He said, take a look at the 5 friends, the 5 people that you most closely associate with, and that will tell you a lot about yourself.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And I think my personal, how would I say, who I am now is very different from who I was as recent as 3 to 5 years ago. And I think that's the same for everyone. And if I were to kind of think about the 5 people I'm closest with, the person I'm most close with is my wife. And so if I use her as a mirror, then I feel that it's true that I have become a bit more rational, a bit more calm, and I don't know, a bit more methodical in the way I think. Whereas pre Julia, pre my wife, I used to be so irrational, so rash, and just make decisions on impulse. So yeah, I guess there's some truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, I think, and I know you touched upon this, but I think maybe if we can go deeper into that, which is the role stress plays at work. I suppose it's one thing to think about it rationally, to put things away, but in reality, I find that in work, you often find that it's not so much your responsibilities or your duties, but the people who lord it over you and who impose a deadline, or who impose, I suppose, conflicting objectives that kind of exacerbate the stress and also make it harder for you to recover from that chronic stress.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ways we can deal with that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the reality is work can be stressful. It is what it is, and stress will always be there. And also, often, type A behavior is encouraged and valued.
That's true.
The person that can work late hours, multitask, being available at all times. And I think we can all admit that we've done this. I certainly can, that I've done this on a number of occasions. And I think, as far as dealing with stress in an organization, I mean, the ideal situation would be that efforts are made at the whole organizational management level, from the top, as well as from the people, the individual levels. But that's the ideal situation. And as an individual, sometimes at the whim of the forces that be, the best advice I can give is to go back to some of the learnings that from chimpanzees and the things that seem to work for us, to be able to alleviate our stress. For example, to be less type A. When you have the choice now, work is always up and down. It isn't a constant high burn.
Yeah.
So take advantage of those little down periods to recharge. social networks, even within the company itself. Having certain individuals that you um, associate with, where you can help, perhaps even um, try to address some of the issues. See if you can get advice from them. Perspective. Again, that was mentioned earlier. Looking at the situation from a different perspective, rather than sometimes when you're handed what you think is an unreasonable deadline, there's a tendency to react with a lot of stress and anger and
Right.
such. But perhaps putting a different perspective on this, as in, what is quite often the case is that your boss's boss has imposed a really unreasonable deadline, and which is trickled down to you. So it's not that one person, the person that immediately comes to mind that you're, pissed off at. Yeah,
It's likely not the culprit.
Yeah, so it just, okay, it's a perspective. We're all in this together, and okay, let's see how we can work together to make it better. And to the extent possible is trying to exercise control of the situation. And again, if maybe the work situation is a little bit outside of your control, there's got to be areas, in smaller areas in your work, where you can have a bit more control, or outside of work. And having a place in your life, I want to say the happy place, where you feel like you do have more control. I think that could help a lot in just dealing with the overall whole gestalt of the situation of your life, the stress at work and all of that. And this is sort of age-old wisdom, which actually, there's scientific merit, is exercise, meditation. There's scientific evidence showing how these activities, even meditation, does alleviate stress. So practicing these would be helpful.
Got it. So what I'm getting is almost 5 things we can do. The first one will be less type A when the opportunity arises. When there's a lull period, take that advantage and really just, kind of calm down from that high. The second thing that we can do is, to lean on our social network, or to lean on our social groups, so to speak. And even if it's in the office, we can find small groups that can relate. The third one is perspective, where just really understanding the situation for what it is rather than the stress it causes.
Yeah.
Number 4 is exercise, and number 5 is meditation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's probably a lot of other things you could add to the list,
Sure,
but these are the 5 that I sort of focus on, and and some of it coming from some interesting data.
Yeah.
Let me just say something about the type A personality traits. I remember reading an article some time ago where they're trying to apply learnings from elite athletes to the corporate situation. Athletes, when they're training for an event, they train in a way so that there's enough rest, enough training, so that they peak in performance for a certain event, for a certain competition. So to apply that thinking to the corporate setting, the type A person, understanding that somebody cannot perform at the peak in every situation, day in, day out, that they need breaks, that there is peaks and troughs, so that if there is, for example, a major event going on, presentation, understanding that, managing the workload, the stress load, all of that, so that they peak at the right time, just as an athlete peaks.
I find that might be quite tricky, right? Because the peaks for athletes, at least, I would say are more clearly defined. You know, like Usain Bolt would know that the Olympics is his cup of
Yeah.
tea or his bread and butter, right? So he's training and he knows that the Olympics is his peak. Whereas when you're at work, especially when you're at a startup, right, you know, it's very blurred. You don't know when is prime time and when is when is an opportunity for you to relax.
You're absolutely right. And I think you have to basically read the situation and get the rest that you need. I mean, it's sort of like something as basic as sleep. There's more and more research coming out showing how important sleep is, and the restorative effects of sleep and the detrimental effects when you don't get it. So rather than rushing to a deadline and staying up all night, get to sleep. Maybe it's just as simple as that.
Right.
But I agree with you. You know, to use this analogy in the workplace can be challenging, but let's aspire to it.
Yeah, I agree. And Kwon, I must say, something that has really changed my I would say it's a health benefit because I've decided that I would sleep enough so that even though I've set an alarm, I would wake up. I wouldn't require the alarm to wake up. And so I've, through a couple of weeks of experimentation, I found out that the ideal time for me to sleep is half an hour before my actual time. So it's about 10:30 would be a good time for me to sleep, and I can wake up at 6:45 without the alarm. And ever since then, I go to work and I can operate through the full day and even beyond and not feel exhausted and not feel drained. And I think sleep might just be the most underrated thing ever, because just a half an hour difference has made such a drastic impact in my life for the better.
Yeah. More and more research is coming out about how beneficial sleep is. And in fact, something that I've been practicing myself is I tend to, I'm a late night person. So I tend to stay up quite late at nights, and I can be very productive then. So what I'm trying to do is let myself go with my natural rhythm, what works for me. So rather than trying to get up early, get in the office at whatever time, I come in a little bit later, and I'll work a little bit later in the evening. That works better for me. For somebody else who's a early morning riser, maybe it doesn't, but I know myself enough that this seems to be working, and I'm getting better quality sleep.
Yeah. Last question, and I think this might be, I mean, I'm not sure if you have the answer to this, but I'd like to ask as well, just based on your experience. If someone is suffering from chronic stress, is there help they can get? Or is it something that they can only really depend on, like, for example, like the suggestions you offered?
In Singapore, over just the last handful of years, they're recognizing that mental illness is a major issue, and they are trying to resolve it, or they're much more open about it. And so I guess with the recognition that there is such a strong relationship between being chronically stressed and mental illness, that I would hope, and I don't have that answer because I'm not a physician practicing here, but that there should be some avenues, some ways that people can approach people for help. MOH, obviously they deal with the more serious cases, but surely there must be a way that people can get help.
Right.
When, before they reach that critical point where they're actually very ill.
Yeah. And I think stress is one of those things where it's such a invisible tipping points, if that makes sense, because it may start off as just a stress that's manageable, and before you know it, it's chronic, and before you realize it, you're burnt out and you're just ready to call it quits. So I think
Yeah.
it's one of those things where you really just have to be very mindful of how it's affecting your body and mind.
Yeah. I mean, it can start off with, deadlines at work. You start cutting back on your sleep. Um, you're a bit more irritable, so you have conflict with other people.
Yeah.
All of these things add up. And yes, it could snowball out of control. And so it's really being mindful and having perspective, taking a step back, and manage a situation, manage yourself.
Right. And before we leave or end this, if there's one thing you would recommend someone who's going through a high stress period in their life now, what would you recommend they do?
Well, what I do when I'm dealing with a lot of stress, and this works for me, is I try to get a bit of exercise. This may not be something for everybody, but one of my favorite places in Singapore is Bukit just because I see greenery.
Yeah.
I see nature, and for me to spend an hour there does a lot for helping me to calm myself down, de-stress. So I think everybody has to sort of figure out for themselves what works for them.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I have figured out what works for me, and so that's what I do. But I must say that sometimes taking your own medicine takes a bit of effort.
It's true. Yeah. And I mean, there's some truth to that, greenery and exercise. I mean, those are nature's cure for many things.
That's right.
Kwon, it's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have conversations with you, and I'm glad I was able to get you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. I hope this was useful.
Yeah, it really was, and people would benefit from it. Thank you.